We are going to look back at Salem one last time. Remember I said that in the aftermath of the Salem witch trials, there were many people who realized that they had done a grievous wrong. But there were others who said, yes, we did a grievous wrong, but we did it for the right reasons. We felt that it was necessary for us to find a better relationship with Providence, with the Almighty. Enter the man that you see below, Jonathan Edwards. He was one of the new fiery preachers that came upon New England at a very crucial time in the early 1700s. Now, you may not know Jonathan Edwards very well, but you certainly know his grandson very well. His grandson's name is Aaron Burr, who was a consummate politician, whereas Edwards was a preacher. It is Edwards and others that is going to reignite religion in the colonies with a new fire, which is called the Great Awakening. So we'll see race and class and how they existed in the colonies, and then we'll see the awakening, which is part of your extra credit that we're trying to put together, the film A Great Awakening, and colonial government as it existed. What you see there is a map of Philadelphia. At the time, the largest city in the colonies, somewhere around 20,000 people. It is a large seaport. It is a very diverse city. It is already a rough and tumble city that belies its name, City of Brotherly Love. It had elites that lived there, like the Franklins, and it had the average ordinary Joes that lived there as well. And as part of the physical makeup of the city, those who were the average ordinary Joes, who when they walked to work in the morning would walk through the affluent neighborhoods and see what they could achieve if they worked hard enough, or develop resentment toward the elites of the colonies. For those who think that slavery was a benign institution, for those who think that slaves were very proper and content in their lot, I give you the Stono Rebellion. Along the Stono River in 1739 in South Carolina, a series of slave rebellions broke out as slaves wished to be free and tried to organize themselves. They were unfortunately outnumbered and outgunned, and so like many of the slave rebellions that would follow, they will be crushed, and they will be crushed brutally. But what this does is it leads the legislatures to enact what are called black codes. These black codes limited the number of African Americans who could gather in one place at one time. It mandated that they have a pass to be off of the plantation or away from the master's home. And it also, of course, created police forces that would patrol the colonies and so forth, which is one of the reasons why you have this long-standing antipathy between African Americans and police forces. In 1712, a riot broke out as blacks attacked whites for various reasons, including oppression, lack of proper pay, living conditions. There's also a growing divide between rich and poor. The social strata is becoming a little too stratified. Backcountry people felt looked down upon by the elite landowners. Interestingly enough, the people that were in the low-lying regions looked down upon those who were in the upcountry. Most conflicts involved rents that the poorer people paid to the elites and Indian policy. In fact, in 1763, the Paxton Boys rose up in Pennsylvania because they felt that they were being unfairly treated in regard to Indian policy. And so they attacked the Conestoga Indians. The one problem was is the Conestoga Indians were not the ones that were causing the trouble. They were a very peaceful tribe. In North and South Carolina, you had groups called the Regulators that ran about the counties of North and South Carolina, beating up Indians, beating up slaves, killing slaves and so forth, which is one of the reasons why the legislatures now begin to have black codes, because while the black codes largely limit the opportunities for freedom for blacks and so forth, it also protects them to a certain degree. And again, that is not me saying that there's benevolence here. It's simply government trying to get a handle on the slave and the Indian issue. The foundations of this country lie in religion, the religious belief in God, and the religious practice, mostly of Puritanism. Puritanism still marks the religious collective consciousness of this country. Now, Puritanism was beginning to evolve. It was coming to be known later as Congregationalism. They were small, independent, Calvinistic congregations. You also had what were called colonial churches. That is, the colonies established a religion. Establishment of a religion meant that you paid a tax. Even if you were Roman Catholic or you were Episcopalian or you were a Baptist, you still paid a tax to the Congregationalist religion. Or if you were in Virginia, to the Church of England. They also began to establish strong anti-Catholic laws. There was nothing more inimical to the colonial makeup than the belief that papism or that papism was somehow undermining the colonial fabric. What was also happening, however, is that many people were going to church and feeling very unfulfilled. This happens from time to time. Religion gets stale. Preachers were just preaching these rote sermons. There was not any sort of feeling or emotion involved in this, no connection. And this is what now starts what is known as the awakening. They felt religion had grown stale. And up steps Jonathan Edwards, a charismatic preacher. He criticized what were called the old lights, that is, the old style preachers who were doing their sort of monotonic preaching from the pulpit. He's animated, he's charismatic, and then he delivers the ultimate sermon of sermons called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He's calling people to come forth to be saved. He's saying that we're all destined for hell unless we throw ourselves upon the mercy of providence. And so people begin to come forward to be saved. This is the beginning of a major movement, a new fire that begins to infect the colonies. And there is an individual aspect to it. It's saying that you have the individual freedom to approach God and throw yourself on God's mercy and receive God's forgiveness and compassion. But you have to be the one to do it. It cannot be through any centralized established church. And where those like Cotton Mather and his father Increase Mather and Jonathan Edwards preached from the pulpits of churches, then came George Whitefield, who is the subject, of course, of the film A Great Awakening. Whitefield is one of the founders of the Methodist Church. He and John Wesley together helped form the Methodist Church. He's an itinerant preacher. He's the Billy Graham of his day. He preaches in open fields and city squares, and he has a booming voice. In an age when you don't have even a megaphone, you have certainly no electronic microphone situations or anything like that, speakers. He could project his voice to a crowd of 10,000 people where the person in the back could hear just as well as the person in the front. And he preached in an egalitarian style. Slaves, African Americans, could be in the crowd along with it. There's no distinction before God when it comes to the church. And with this, he begins to fire up people. And again, the idea of this individual liberty to approach God. And this individual liberty now begins to creep into politics as well. Now, this, of course, creates colonial tension. The old lights are still there. Harvard and Yale are still there. And they dismiss the new lights. This is just a flash in the pan. These are song and dance men that are going nowhere. But these song and dance men were doing a really effective song and dance. And as a result of this, the new lights decide that they need to start creating preachers of their own. And so they start building their own colleges. Princeton in New Jersey, Rutgers in New Jersey, Brown in Providence, Rhode Island, and Dartmouth in Manchester, New Hampshire. These things, these religious movements and so forth, resist an overly centralized authority. a centralized church, and therefore a centralized government. There's a more democratic ideal. You see here that the Great Awakening is the foundation of the American Revolution. Now let's turn and look at the colonial governments and how the colonial governments related to the British Parliament in Westminster in London. Now, from the colonial perspective, the Parliament at Westminster in London was in charge of essentially their foreign policy and overall defense together of all the colonies. But the colonial legislature, or the burgesses, or the assemblies, and so forth, they're equal with Parliament. They have the same authority within the colonies. Now, from the London perspective, the Parliament in Westminster is supreme and would legislate for all the colonies. However, from 1607 until 1763, the Parliament in London paid very little attention to the internal relations of the colonies. They simply said, here, you make sure that you keep sending raw materials, crops, lumber, wheat, flaxseed, tobacco, of course, rice, to England. And we'll just simply look the other way while you run your own affairs. This is what is known as salutary neglect. Salutary neglect is the arrangement. It's not written into law or anything like that. It is simply a tacit arrangement between the Parliament in Westminster and the colonial assemblies to allow the colonial assemblies to run the colonies internally, and as long as they kept up their end of the bargain, which was sending unfinished raw materials back to the factories of England. I put that into large print. Therefore, it is an important term for you to understand. Thus, under the arrangement of salutary neglect, the imperial government's job was to execute imperial policy, make sure that the Navy was available and that British troops were available in case Indians attacked all the colonies, or the French, or the Spanish. That was their job, defense. The colonies, they handled nuts and bolts operations. Now, Parliament believed them to be ad hoc committees. The colonies believed them to be legitimate legislatures. Within the colonies themselves, government was a complex thing. It was often a struggle between the colonial governor, who is representing the crown, who is representing the Westminster Parliament, and the assemblies, who are representing, of course, their own colonies. There was a great deal of colonial insubordination to the colonial governors. The assemblies are raucous. The assemblies are an obstacle to stability in the colonies. The assemblies were very recalcitrant at times when it came to the governor. So there's a great deal of tension in the colonies. Let's look at the colonial governor. On the surface, the colonial governor is very, very powerful. He has the power of appointment. That is, he can appoint people to office. He has the veto over anything that the legislature can do. He has the ability to hand out those very valuable land grants, as we are well familiar with our current chief executive in this country. The colonial governor also has the power of the pardon, and the power of the pardon is absolute. And he can give reprieves. He can commute sentences of execution or jail time and so forth. He's the commander-in-chief and the Indian policy negotiator. In reality, though, the governor's not all that powerful. You didn't send the best and the brightest to be governors of the colonies. These were guys who maybe have failed at other colonial positions, or had suffered some sort of a disgrace in the field and military, and this was a chance for them to kind of reclaim themselves. Furthermore, the Board of Trade in London set the law and the tradition that the colonies and the governors had to follow. governors also didn't serve very long terms. They would serve 2, maybe 4 years as a term, and then they were out. And so they didn't have enough time often to develop a strong relationship with their colonies. And the governor, despite the pardons and the reprieves and the land grants, only had a limited number of favors that he could give away. And he was absolutely at the mercy of the assembly when it came to his salary. It was the assembly that paid the governor's salary. And a governor that got to be too high-handed and too imperious would often find that the legislatures, quote unquote, could not find the money to pay him from time to time. While assemblies could be raucous, inefficient, unstable, they were far more powerful than at first glance. First and foremost, they were dominated by the elites who could afford to hold the offices. Remember, if you're just a yeoman farmer and you're scratching out a living, it's a daily struggle. You don't have time for government. If you're an elite who has a large plantation and you have plenty of slaves, or you're a wealthy merchant, then you have the time and you have the ability to hold that office. And most importantly, you have the money to hold that office. Therefore, elites who were far more invested in their colony's success and their colony's life than the governor was, could unite against the governor. And as I've already pointed out, they paid the salary and they gathered the taxes. They have the power of the purse.